How useful a source is B and C for an inquiry into opposition to the Nazis. Explain your answer using sources B and C and your knowledge of the historical context. 8 marks. Here's the mark scheme for this question, which you can find out about in more detail in the overview video. But we do know that all 8 marks here are awarded for AO3, and that's your analysis and evaluation of source utility. All that means really is you making a judgment on how useful this source is to the inquiry that you've been given in the question. In order to make that judgment, you might focus on one of these things, so how accurate it might be, how reliable you think it is, any limitations, so things that it doesn't include or isn't really that helpful for, knowledge of the author which is given to you above the source, or valuable information offered by the source. If you can focus on maybe 1 or 2 of these to decide how useful the source is for your inquiry, it's a really easy way to score highly in AO3. That means that rather than just making an assertion, so saying this source is useful, you need to reason, you need to use one of these factors above to decide how useful the source is. You'll also be thinking about the content, so what the source actually says. You'll be thinking about the context, so what you know about when it was written or what it's written about. And provenance, so who wrote it, when did they write it, why did they write it, and so on. So just try and keep those things in mind. You don't have to talk about everything, but just try and keep them in mind to make sure that your answer is really nicely focused on utility. It's also important to remember that the question isn't asking you to compare source B and source C. In fact, you could actually talk about them separately. You've got to think about why B is useful and why C is useful, not if one is more useful than the other. Here are the bands for this question. Now you can see in order to score in the highest band, you need to show developed reasoning. So maybe you've used one of the factors that we listed above to make a judgment on how useful the source is and really clearly explain your thinking. You've also considered the provenance, so where the source came from, and how that might impact how useful the source is. You could also draw in some contextual knowledge, so stuff that you already know about the topic, to help you to interpret the source and make that judgment. Essentially, this question is all about stating how useful you think the source is, using the information given to you in the source and before it, and the information that you already have about the topic, to explain why you made that judgment. Showing that you can do this well is how you can score in the highest band. There are lots of points you can make here, so as long as what you say is relevant to the question and correct, the examiner should award you the marks. But let's have a look at the mark scheme. Now, the mark scheme for this question is structured in a really important way because it divides into the usefulness of the content of the source, the usefulness of its provenance and its purpose, and of its historical context. So let's go back to content, what the source actually tells you. One point might be that in contrast to the military focus and strict discipline of the Hitler Youth, the Edelweiss pirates did not seem to be a violent resistance force, but rather seemed to embody characteristics condemned by the Nazis. As we can see, they're wearing more casual clothing, they're playing music, and so on. In terms of its provenance and purpose, we know that as a photograph, it's likely to provide an accurate insight into the activities of the Edelweiss pirates. And finally, bringing in your historical context, you could say that they weren't a violent organisation, but their resistance was problematic for the Nazis because they wanted total control over young people in order to secure a stable political support system amongst the youth. Now, if you can link all of those 3 things together, so kind of hitting all 3 factors that the mark scheme wants you to, that's a really nicely developed point. You've thought about it from so many different angles. You've thought about it in relation to what the questions asked you specifically to focus on, and you've tied it all together really nicely. So do try and hit all 3 of those factors on the mark scheme to make sure you score in the top bands. Take a look at the rest of the points though, and those for source C in a minute, to see if there's anything else you could have added to your answer.